In earlier lessons, we've seen that the circulatory system helps maintain homeostasis by transporting materials like oxygen to cells. But how does oxygen get into the body in the first place? That is the question we will explore in our video on gas exchange. To start off, there are really 3 steps or phases to gas exchange. The first one is breathing, moving gases into the lungs and out of the lungs. The second step, which we've explored in detail, is the circulatory system transporting the gases to all the cells of the body. And then the final step is, once the blood comes in contact with the cells at the capillaries, the oxygen will diffuse into the cells and carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the cells. And the reason that happens is because the mitochondria need the oxygen to help produce usable energy, ATP. In this video, we're going to focus on this first step, breathing. And that is the job of the human respiratory system, which has a few important tissues and organs. Let's start at the beginning. First, we have the nasal cavity. Air enters here. Then air passes into the pharynx. From the pharynx, air enters the larynx. It then travels through this pipe, known as the trachea, and then enters the lungs. It enters the lungs through smaller tubes, known as the bronchus, singular, or bronchi, plural, which then branches into smaller tubes, the bronchioles. And the movement of the lungs that helps take in and out is controlled by a muscle below the lungs known as the diaphragm. Now let's take a closer look at the function of some of these organs. First, we have the nasal cavity. The job of the nasal cavity is to warm and filter air, and it does that using the mucus and the cilia, the little hairs that are inside the nose. And the mucus and the cilia will trap particles that shouldn't enter the respiratory system, and the cilia can brush particles outside. From there, air enters the pharynx. This is just a fancy word for your throat, and it's a passage for both air and food. After the pharynx, we've got the larynx. As you can see, we're looking down the larynx. We're not looking at the front of the larynx. And the larynx is lined with cartilage. This is a flexible but sturdy material that helps support it. And then within the larynx are the vocal cords, which are stretchy and elastic. And if your muscles tighten the vocal cords and air passes over them, sound will be produced. From the larynx, we now have the trachea, which is a long tube, also known as your windpipe, and this will lead air into your lungs. And there are some great structure-function connections here. First of all, trachea is surrounded by rings of cartilage, and this helps support the air pipe so that it doesn't collapse. If it collapsed, you would asphyxiate from lack of oxygen. The trachea is also lined with mucus and cilia, again to help filter the air and warm the air. Next stop is the bronchi, the branches leading into the lungs. And like the trachea, they have cartilage lining them, along with mucus and cilia to warm and filter the air. Those branch off into the very tiny bronchioles, which kind of look like the roots of a tree. In fact, this is called the bronchial tree. And these tubes end in special structures called alveoli. Let's take a look at those. Now this is magnified quite a bit, but what these are air sacs. And they kind of look like a bunch of grapes at the end of the bronchiole. And these air sacs are surrounded by capillaries. This is where the action for the pulmonary loop of the circulatory system really happens. So air that's coming in to the lungs will contain a lot of oxygen. That oxygen will diffuse through the very thin wall of the alveolus and into the capillaries, turning it, the blood, bright red. And then the blood will head off back to the lungs to enter the systemic loop. Meanwhile, oxygen-poor blood, which is high in carbon dioxide, will come into the capillaries, and carbon dioxide will diffuse from the capillaries through the thin walls and then into the alveoli, and then the lungs will take the CO2 out. And all this is possible because of the structure. These air sacs are very thin and very moist. Now, what makes the air come into the alveoli or go out? Well, breathing is really controlled by your diaphragm. When this muscle contracts, what that means is that it moves down. That makes the lungs bigger, and so air comes in. Meanwhile, during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes. It moves up, which makes the lungs smaller, which forces air out so that you exhale. One final note about respiration. We just explored the human respiratory system, but there's something interesting that it has in common with other animals. Here are human lungs, the trachea of insects, the skin of earthworms, and the gills of fish. These are all the respiratory structures in various animals. And what they have in common is that they're all very thin and very moist. And that allows carbon dioxide and oxygen to diffuse easily in and out of cells, which, as we know, are full of water and are surrounded by water. And that concludes our tour of the respiratory system, which is responsible for the first step of gas exchange.